But the problem with MAGA communism, sorry to circle back to that, but the big problem is it isn't a Marxist thing. I mean, they might talk about Marxism, they might read Marx, they might incorporate Marx into a speech or even have debates about Marx. The primary thing that they care about is cultural arguments. They don't mobilize over Marxist stuff. They mobilize over cultural issues. That's what animates them. That's what they care about. And that is just, it's just outwardly not, even if there is a Marxist element of it and they like to talk about Marx and they like to use Marx for analysis, or the people who were kind of counteracting the fact that the algorithm doesn't really recommend my videos, the people who visited the BreadTube subreddit, for instance, they just sort of completely abandoned watching me. And that was basically that for my channel.
So what was your critique of BreadTube?
There is a lot of different aspects to it. The first, I would even say primary aspect, though, is that it's just a fandom.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like, you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today, I'm here with a very special and familiar guest, or familiar to some who have been around the left side of YouTube for quite a while. And for those who have been watching the One Dime channel for a long time, day one One Dime viewers might remember Peter Coffin sharing my very, very first video that I made some long time ago. I've always thought that Peter Coffin makes some of the best YouTube videos on the socialist Marxist side of YouTube for quite a while. He's been through quite a lot of trials and tribulations, a lot of dramas that perhaps maybe is the reason why some people know who you are, but don't maybe know your videos. They know you through associations or through tweets. So there's a lot of stuff to address. Frankly, I had stopped watching your content for a certain period. I was watching for a while, way back before you deleted a lot of your videos, which I wanted to ask you later on why. You have some gems that deleted. Some might remember some classics, some of which are still up, like Somewhere to Belong, Cancel Culture, or Capitalist Culture. Some of those are my favorite videos. Most recently did one, Plato's a Bitch, which is about a copyright, kind of a response to the whole H-Bomber guy saga. For those who know what that is. Yeah, Peter Coffin is a veteran in this industry. What else can I say?
I do appreciate all the kind words, though. That's not often how I'm introduced in places.
Yeah, and I want to start off by like clarifying something, because part of what made me want to get you on this podcast is I checked your channel out of nowhere. I was just like, what is Peter Coffin doing? And I saw you had this one on Green Day and MAGA Communism. I'll put a clip of what you said for the listeners to listen to.
Okay.
I do kind of want to take this opportunity to talk about MAGA communism. The underlying idea of wanting to bring the proletariat, which often supports MAGA, often is in industrial jobs, farming, trucking, etc., wanting to bring those people class consciousness is a good idea. But I'll tell you that that is the least productive brand ever. MAGA and communism are two words that create this kind of reaction. I'm usually pretty straightforward about being a communist, but I usually don't say like, "Hi, my name is Peter Coffin. I'm a fucking communist." I have my kids' drawings up there. I have some art over there that you can't see. My point is that MAGA is an extreme partisan brand that pisses people off. Just like communism, and I'm not saying the kind of communism I'm pushing, but just the word communism, the brand communism. It does the same thing. People hate communism in the same way they hate MAGA. Because in their eyes, it's an extreme political brand. So it's two very extreme political brands that both have extremely large hate followings and tiny slices of people that will tolerate both of those. In other words, it's a real, I'm very unique brand to be a MAGA communist.
I really like the way you articulated your critique of MAGA communism. And it surprised me because, to be honest, I thought for a while you were part of the MAGA communism camp. I thought, and that might have been due to certain associations, or it might have been due to I think you wore like American flag onesie in the video once. And I remember seeing that. I never actually saw that video, but I remember seeing it on Twitter and I was like, what? Did this guy lose his mind or something?
I do have to recommend the video where I wear the American flag onesie. It's a free speech video, and it's a video about how in a capitalist country you don't actually have free speech, because I don't know if you recall, if you've ever heard the phrase or if you recall it, freedom of the press is for freedom, or freedom of the press is for people who own a printing press. Free speech, I mean, to use the word free in more of a monetary or value indicating sense, we don't have. We have, in many respects, paid speech. Like, you get a platform, you are sort of permitted an audience in that way. A lot of the time, people have to spend a lot of money advertising themselves in certain ways. The speech that gets the most weight has money behind it generally.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of a way of critiquing a sort of endlessly ongoing issue from a
But why'd you wear
hopefully
a
different
American
perspective.
flag onesie?
What's that?
Why'd you wear an American flag onesie?
Well, I think it's funny. If you really want to drill it down, it's because I think it's funny. It's also, it bothers people a lot. Like,
It
you'd
did.
be amazed how much people are bothered by the idea of somebody wearing an American flag onesie. And I also, I did my hair blue, or no, I did my hair red. And I did blue stripes in my beard. So it was an American flag. And it was, I don't know which color was which. I really can't remember. But that infuriates people to me, reasons I don't understand. But like, I think that getting people mad at that type of a thing, where it's kind of like, all right, you're mad at a visual, but you have no idea what I'm saying. You're refusing to engage with. I just think that's really funny, personally.
Right. I mean, that's the nature of these platforms, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Twitter. But
Exactly.
yeah, that was something I saw. I thought you kind of were in the MAGA communism camp. Now, unlike some people, I didn't rush to go like think Peter Coffin should be canceled or whatever. I was just like, you're kind of flirting with like that stupid shit. But I saw, this clip that I'm referring to, where you addressed and clarified your position on MAGA communism, which I thought was a very nuanced one. And I'd like to give you the chance to clarify that to the audience, to sort of defend yourself, so to speak. Because I think some people watching this are going to be like, Peter Coffin, what's he been up to? Some people who like your content, and some people who just know you online and probably just hate your guts, who are like, this guy's a MAGA LaRoucheite, fascist, whatever they want to.
The LaRouche thing, I've never understood why people call me that. Like, I have never read LaRouche. I have looked at like some of his ideas, and like, it kind of looks like he just sort of stole from Marx and called it LaRouche, and also went completely batshit insane. But in terms of MAGA communism, my feelings on it are, I understand the impulse. I get the idea of attempting to reach out to people that the left doesn't normally, view as worthwhile to reach out to, because in my life, I do a lot of that. I speak to a lot of conservatives in real life. I have conservative family members. I've lived in a lot of conservative areas, and I'm a communist, and it's basically impossible for me to hide that because I'm very vocally on the internet a communist, and eventually the internet follows me basically anywhere. But I get that impulse. I like that impulse even. I think that it's good to want to say to people who don't already agree with you something that you might think is appealing to them and attempt to at least convey what you believe to them, hoping that it might open their eyes or convince them or even just have them look at you in a non-hostile way for thinking that. I get that, and I believe in that. But I don't believe that MAGA and communism are like, you can't really look at these things definitionally. If you do, I think that you're looking at things wrong. You're looking at how content works wrong. You're looking at how entertainment works wrong. These things are brands. MAGA and communism are brands in the public sphere. And with MAGA and communism, it's essentially creating a tiny segment of people who are both comfortable with MAGA and comfortable with communism. You're appealing to the tiny number of people who are in one of those camps and don't hate the other camp, and therefore are going to be loyal to you because you're basically the only that. And you're engineering a fandom oriented around contrarianism mostly. And I know a lot of people love to call me a contrarian, but to me, you can't get more contrarian than that because you're actually physically you're reducing two groups down to their most like niche elements. There are so few communists who are like, yeah, MAGA. And there's so few MAGA people who don't think like communism is here to kill us. Like Joe Biden's a communist, and that's why communism is bad. Like there's so few people that are like that. To find the segment of compatible people with that is to make such a small, hostile, and contrarian niche that I think that it doesn't do what they're advertising it to do. It is not an effective means to reach out to conservatives and attempt to tell them about like class struggle, to tell them about how it is you versus they know that it's them versus the boss. They just don't look at it in the way that I might look at it. I find it to be a contrarian brand, and I don't think it is a productive thing. I don't think it's fascism. That's the element that I think is very important to talk about, though. I don't see those people as fascists. I see them as fandom communists who don't like the left aesthetic. That's mostly how I see it. It's contrarianism. It's people who are doing lifestyle stuff. It's LARPy. It's cosplay in a lot of ways, but it's very contrarian cosplay. I'm that, but I'm also or in opposition to that. I don't really, with the generalizations, it's probably the wrong way of saying it, but it's kind of just like, I'm super unique. I have a unique selling point. I'm the communist that likes MAGA. I'm the MAGA that likes communism. I'm very, very different than other people. Please pay attention to me.
Right. I think you excellently capture like the online dynamic of it. Its psychological appeal and really what it is in its essence or its substance or lack of substance. However, I think people, the reason why they call it fascist or they call it fascistic is just because they see the word socialist and then they see socially conservative tendencies, or at least attempts in an almost parody form to appeal to conservative sentiments, whether that be America's traditions of founding fathers, which I don't think that is particularly radical or even conservative. If you look at a lot of old socialists, they've done that too. But I think what people are really annoyed by and really dislike, and this is where the emotional, visceral reactions come from, is elements of transphobia or sort of bigotry, whether it be subtle or explicit in certain cases. The anti-LGBT stuff, that's where they say that's fascist. And I think I would agree that it's reactionary.
Sure.
Undoubtedly, it's reactionary, and it's definitely something I don't agree with. And I don't think
Same.
And I also don't think it's necessary to like appeal to regular workers.
No,
how they
I think that in fact, if you're like overly pro-trans or overly anti-trans, I think those are both the ways that you can become unappealing the quickest to a normal person.
I mean, another point I think to add to this is people overlook how conservative actually existing socialism was.
That's fair.
And so just to be factual, if one wants to be honest about the legacy of actually existing socialism, both in the ones that fell and the ones that still exist, whether you want to call them socialist or not, but like Vietnam, China, I mean, they're pretty highly socially conservative. And I don't think anyone with a brain would call them fascist governments.
No, I would hope
not
not
ideological.
anyway.
But they have a
They-
conservative aspect to them. And that's going to be something we disagree with or think that maybe isn't compatible with our belief systems, whatever. One can have a disagreement, but I think calling it fascist is so ahistorical. It ignores not just how like communists, how conservative many communists were, but even like reformist communists like Salvador Allende were pretty like explicitly homophobic. So
Sure.
I think what people forget is like, yeah, while we might have certain positions, progress doesn't take place as fast as you might think it does. Like
Yes.
just pretty recently, people were, I mean, the Democratic frontrunner Hillary Clinton at one point was opposed to gay marriage.
I mean, that wasn't even that long ago. I mean, she opposed it after it was law, wasn't it?
It was pretty
was
recent, and I guess the point
Extremely
being,
late in the game. I think that Obama was pretty. He was anti-gay marriage, and it was during his second term, I think it was, that it was legalized. I can't remember.
I think it was 2013 when the court ruling happened, which allowed it. But
Right.
in the
But
comments,
he switched. He was, I think it was 2 years before the court ruling, if I remember right. We're getting into events where I'm just sort of trying to remember what year things were, which is maybe not my strongest suit if I'm going through my own memory and
Right.
experiences. But yeah, I mean, what I had said a moment ago about whether you're extremely pro or anti, whether it's trans or any other LGBT thing, there's a certain element where I try to separate LGBTQ plus from sexual and gender minorities, the actual people, because there is an ideology of identity politics that is very present in that type of activism. But it's also very important to remember that we're talking about people, and the vast majority of any group is just normal people, like people who are going about their lives and being like, and that's what I think that a group like MAGA Communist or MAGA Communism, or even if you go the total flip side, which is the very, very loud, screechy I'm using scare quotes here because I hesitate to call this the pro-trans movement, because a lot of the time, like I said, it's a very small vocal minority within a minority. Like the vast majority of any group is just normal people.
Gotta be careful, Peter.
I know it's
They're
really hard to
gonna-
make these distinctions, but
They're gonna say you're making a false equivalence between people who are very pro-trans and very anti-trans. I don't know if you want to clarify.
well,
And
it depends on where you're coming from. I'm talking about when I am talking about analysis or analogies, I'm attempting to come from where is the ignorant view. Whereas when somebody's not paying close attention to this side or both sides, what are they thinking? And that's why I say this. There are very, very, I think, identity politics oriented people who attempt to fight for the rights of sexual and gender minorities, members of sexual and gender minority groups. And I think that those people are often not the best representation of those groups of people. They don't speak for the majority of those groups of people. I think they're also, in a lot of cases, intentionally put forward that to kind of make, like, the more conservative one is, the more likely one is to want that group to be the prominent version of that activism. And I think that that ends up creating issues. And I think understanding MAGA communism as kind of a reaction to that specifically allows you to situate exactly what they are, because they're kind of just like accepting the idea that that group is all there is and signaling that they're somehow a different, smarter form of communism simply because they acknowledge that that group is whatever the conservatives say about them. And the thing is, I don't like that group of people. I think that they are not representative of the group that they're attempting to speak for. I think that I've been very critical of the idea of representation, because I think the model minority dynamic is kind of inherent in representation, because all of our media outlets and our prominent media outlets, I shouldn't say all of our media outlets, but the most prominent media outlets are owned by very, very large forces that are often, if not socially conservative, at very least, very, very, very pro-capitalist. And they set forward standards and norms through representation. And I think that that is something that very little of the time is considered when people go forward with what images they present and what rhetoric they use. Again, like I said, I try to come from like, all right, what does the ignorant person see here? What is somebody who has absolutely no idea what this person's views are, what that person's views are? What do they think? And I think MAGA communism can best be seen as attempting to basically use that group of people as a legitimizing factor with conservatives.
Yeah, in that clip you mentioned that you don't just tell people, "Oh, I'm a communist." It's, I mean, you are open about it, but it's not the first thing you say down their throat. And I think that's kind of what you're trying to say about the identity politics, LGBT stuff. It's the way I understand it too, because I think it's not. Well, I got in a very unfortunate conversation with one person who blocked me before I could even really respond about this, because I said, strategically, from a pure strategic point of view, it's not really good to center an issue that appeals to a very small minority of the population as part of a politics in which you intend to get at least a small minority, a small majority, or a big minority of the population. You know, for any politics to succeed, it has to have
plurality at very like,
yeah,
if that's what you're aiming for, yes.
Yeah, it has to have at least like 20-30%. I mean, at least.
Sure.
So but you're not going to do that by centering an issue that is inherently fringe, and people are ignorant. Like I like to use the word ignorant rather than stupid, because stupid implies like people aren't. There's like this caste system of like the smart people who have the correct things and the dumb people who don't. But I think it's like, I don't know. My parents don't know much about like the LGBT stuff. They're kind of like, I mean, people do whatever they do in their private lives, but like I don't really like want to hear about this all the time. Regular people, they see, why is Bruce Jenner the woman of the year?
But then I mean, if you start saying the F slur to them, I'll bet they wouldn't like that.
Yeah. It's like, I think that's the default position of a lot of people. It's like a sort of libertarian position, which is people do what they want. I think that's really an American like liberal tradition as well.
Yes.
Like we can do what we want in our private lives, but don't impose it. And I think that's where I see the really pro-trans thing. And here's the thing. I don't think the really pro-trans stuff that Hollywood might be supposedly trying to shove down our throat, I don't think it's a really big problem, which is why I never been really hard on the anti-woke train, which I know you have some interesting thoughts on about woke outbrows and all that.
Sure.
But
yeah.
I always thought it was kind of counterproductive. Like I didn't think it was a huge problem. Like
it's not.
Yeah, so that's why I never like jumped on the anti-woke trend. I think like most people who are like queer or LGBT, they just kind of want to be at peace and not, like live their lives.
Exactly.
Not
100%.
be discriminated. But I guess I think people want to feel like they have an identity. So just like how someone might want to be, I'm a Maoist and wear Che Guevara t-shirt and Yeah,
You really
it's like
got it right there.
LGBT. I see like Pride Month kind of like that. Like,
I do as well. It's
totally.
fandom. It sucks. I don't like the fact that it's fandom because I do think, like when you said a moment ago, you can't really center niche ideas as like a vector for attempting to manage to get a plurality of the population on board for something.
Yeah, and that applies to Leninism too.
Yes, no, I do agree with you.
Yeah.
But I think the issue here with that specifically is that it's not impossible to frame the issues that sexual and gender minorities, people in those groups face. You don't actually have to frame it through identity. You can frame it in a way that actually does integrate and work with a genuine, like, we're trying to help everybody out situation. Like, that's the thing. When I'm railing against identity politics, I am not railing against advocacy for people of marginalized groups. And a lot of people think that I am. And that is something that it's unfortunate because I'm painted that way, and that often gets to people before I get to people to explain what I mean by things. And of course, the internet, they sort of pick the things that are the most interesting, let's say, to spread around. And that usually ends up being the more baity or jokey or the attention grabbing element of the statement, which, I mean, you make content as well. You know that you have to create some statement that creates intrigue. And I'm very good at doing that. I'm just not very good at getting people to watch the rest of the thing. Or rather, other people are very good at getting people not to watch the rest of the thing and just judge me based on the sort of attention grabbing statement.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing to navigate. And I think that is why it's really hard to talk about these issues. People will get scared of stuff they don't know. It's just human nature. I mean, people naturally want to preserve their life, so they'll kind of try to be risk averse in certain ways. I think there's a sort of almost conservative disposition in human behavior in that regard. And we have to be aware of that. So it's not so much to pander to like reactionary tendencies like scapegoating LGBT people. I think that's really bad and really dangerous.
Absolutely.
I think what happens is some people, they don't think very far ahead or how to communicate what they want to say. So they say it in a kind of half-assed way. And I think that's what happens is you see people, they get pushed in these corners. Like they try to express a dissident opinion on the trademark left, and then they get backlash, and then they get backed in these little corners where they get actually more fringe, and they kind of do the thing that the left does, but in a more fringer way. And they'll be like, I'm not like the left. I am post-left, or I am whatever, MAGA communists. I kind of saw it to an extent that sort of happened to you. Like, if I'm being honest, like maybe what you actually believed substance-wise didn't change all that much, but I did see that. Like, I think you kind of play into...
I'll push back against people who are being antagonistic in certain ways. Yes, absolutely.
You get Jewish songs from pissing off left people. You enjoy it.
No, I do. And the thing is, I mean, I have a lot of reasons to back it up, but like to some extent, I don't have a problem with pissing off the left because I generally attempt to look at things through a class lens. And I actually think that the left-right divide is a kind of outdated way of seeing things. I do think, obviously, there are, of course, conservative and liberal leftist ideologies, but I think that that's exactly what they are. They're ideologies that sort of provide ways that, in my opinion, particularly with the left, I feel like a lot of leftist ideology provides dissident feelings and observations with a means to not actually harm the system at play. They're justifying ideologies, but not in the way that somebody who would hear the word justifying ideology would think, but rather a more adapting, like it takes concerns and redirects them in ways. I was just talking about representation. It's a very good example of what I'm talking about. Like, people are correct when they say, I don't see enough people like me on the TV, because that's true. Or streamers now, I guess, is probably it's probably better to say Netflix or Hulu or whatever than TV. But the point is, I don't see a lot of people like me on that thing. That's a real concern. And it is rooted in capitalist class dynamics and ownership. And it's real. It's not a fake concern. But the way that they have given us representation matters is not real. It's a means to bring us back into the consumer paradigm where we're making choices in a consumer market as opposed to collectivizing power against an institution or structure.
Right. Yeah. It's like market driven politics. When there's sort of
Yes.
demand for something, the market finds a way to supply that demand, and representation is just the equation. And I think it applies too with communism. Like, and you covered that well in your Marx for Sale documentary, which in a way that people can be sold back. Like market driven politics, when there's a demand for transgression, people want to transgress the system supplies it in all these ways. And the left, I think, has become sort of controlled opposition, contained opposition, in which we're like in this little playground that we police ourselves in, and we get enjoyment out of sublimating our transgressive urges. I've talked about in that video, contained opposition. But I think the issue of powerlessness is really self-defeating, because people want to cope with their powerlessness by policing each other.
Within any group, there's people that do bad things, and mostly people who just exist. Like, that's how everybody is. And to scapegoat one group, LGBT people, black people, whatever, as the baddies is just completely ignoring that that's true of every single group.
Right. Yeah, but it is dangerous in the sense that it's the easiest to scapegoat a small group, because it's
Absolutely.
Like, I think it has a consequence. And of course, like I think in many ways LGBT are becoming the new scapegoat, which is why I try to like address this issue without playing into the anti like LGBT sentiment. And I saw a big contradiction in a protest in Canada right before all the Palestine protests were happening. Because right now there's this weird like sort of temporary unity between non-left Muslims and the left on Palestine, which I think is great and fantastic. But we forget that just actually a few months before October 7th and all that, there was actually like huge protests in Canada that were about like the education system that was teaching kids about trans and stuff. Like a big opposition to that. And a lot of Muslims, this is what people were talking about. And the conservatives were saying, we have like now Muslims on our side and all that. So what I'm saying is to like, be careful about the issue. It's like we can support a policy that is protective of the trans community, but at the same time, like, you don't go to like the average person being like, do stuff that would scare them. It's like communism too. Revolution is also a really bad thing to like put at the center. Like,
I tend to not say the word revolution. Yes. But I call it yes, but it's good leftism. It's basically, they've spent a lot of decades after the Red Scare kind of just taking things that people characterized the left or communists during the Red Scare, and their rebuttal, instead of learning this stuff and figuring out how to actually apply it to communities, organizing, etc. Instead, they just say, yes, but it's good. And it's not a good, it's the worst way. Like it really doesn't help. It, like, when you say like, yes, I am the evil person who's trying to destroy the thing and it's good, but it's like, how do you think you're going to convince this person of anything? Much less, how do you think you're going to get them excited for you? Like, I don't understand how, like, I don't think that trans issues are actually a threat to anyone's religion, for instance.
Yeah, I agree.
I don't understand how positioning the trans people as destroying the Catholic Church, which I've seen some trans people do as a positive idea, I don't understand how that is helpful to anyone. And those are the people that the conservatives, like I said, lift those people up and make sure they're the version of the trans issue that's seen. And it's just, it's a quagmire, because really what, like you said earlier, what trans people generally want is to exist and not be impeded by institutional barriers or just have some level of respect within their own community. Like not even necessarily like special treatment of any kind, which a lot of people think that they are out for. It's not that. It's generally people want to just be people in society, and they would like it if society was a little better.
Yeah, and also there's like a small minority that always speaks on the behalf of this community. As a this person,
Oh my
I
God.
reflect, and one of the perfect examples of that is that there is like some people in the trans community who advocate abolishing parental custody so that you can change your gender without parental consent before you're 18. And it's like, I don't think most people who are queer support that. Like,
I don't either.
I don't think so. Like, I think most people struggle with dysphoria. It's not like a choice. It sounds like a difficult experience. So it's like the idea like, oh, removing custody, like that's going to help my problems. I don't think most people believe that. But the problem is when people who claim to be representatives of a community support that stuff, and then as a result, that not only alienates normal people, but when you try to critique that, they'll say, you're critiquing the trans community. It's like,
yes.
What evidence?
Well, I think that's the more dangerous. Yeah, I think that's the worst element of it. It's when a viewpoint that is not the view of the entire community. This happens with Indigenous people a lot as well. I grew up in a small town that its sister city, so to speak, was a Native American reservation. And I'm more than familiar with I've been on the Native American reservation. They built a casino in Hartford, Michigan, which is 5 miles from my town, Watervliet, Michigan. I'm familiar with those folks. And the police chief in my town was Chief Johnny Pokagan, a Native American guy. He was a policeman. He had an American flag on his property. He was not the only person on the reservation that had an American flag on his property. I mean, there is a lot of conservative elements in those communities, and any community, any identity of people. And I've really put this out there throughout what I've been saying. No one view is ever really representative of them. And that's, I think, the problem of the sort of, when I say this, I'm using scare quotes, the extremist trans advocates. I'm using scare quotes because I don't want to try to act as though it is wrong to advocate for trans people's rights. I agree with trans rights. And I know that there are going to be people that attempt to try to take me out of context. But you can't assign any one view. And then some of those views are so blatantly irresponsible, because a young person, like I'm 39 now, and if I made permanent choices when I was 16, my life would really suck right now. There are so many things that are less permanent and less severe than taking hormones or even gender reassignment surgery that I should never, like those things shouldn't have entered into my life until I was an adult. And a lot of decisions that I made, even as with less permanent consequences, had effects on my adult life that were detrimental. I'm not saying that it's detrimental to transition or that it may not help somebody who is in one of those situations, but it's very easy to make decisions that you would regret if they were entirely permanent when you have less life experience. And that isn't to say somebody with more life experience is necessarily smarter. It's not. I mean, that is 100% not an automatic thing, but there's a reason why we don't let people drink. There's a reason why there's an age of consent. There's a reason for those things. And it's because all of them represent some element of permanence. If you develop an alcohol dependency, that is going to drastically alter the course of your life. And it is not a good idea to have minors drinking alcohol because they're a lot more likely to become extreme in their consumption because it's in many ways, it's subversive in some ways, it's countercultural, it's going against their parents' wishes, et cetera, et cetera. It's very, very easy for underage folks in that and believe me, I'm not equating this to trans. I'm just talking about it as a permanent thing. But it's a situation that it has very different consequences. It has very, I mean, I know a lot of people in 12-step programs, and I care deeply about the life that they have led that brought them to that point. And a lot of those things I see as perhaps maybe a lot more automatically detrimental, but actually a little less permanent than making a decision about like modifying your body in some way. It's not necessarily that one is better than the other. I'm certainly not saying that like trans is as bad as alcoholism or anything like that, but like, because it's not.
It's also not a pleasant thing, right? Like,
yeah,
not like something to take lightly. It's probably
these are
a pretty big traumatic life decision.
Exactly. Well, it's like when people talk about abortion, like people are getting pregnant specifically to get abortions. Like there is this conservative element that seems to think that there's a large contingent of women that just fucking love getting abortion. And it's like, no, that is a traumatic, invasive operation that has a recovery period because you're actually, to some extent, being injured during the course of it. It's a serious thing. And again, like getting an abortion or trans or alcoholism, these are very fundamentally different issues in a lot of ways, but we don't look at these things from the outside with the same eyes as somebody who has actually done those things. And then when you get into people who have done those things and maybe regret it, whether they have or have not detransitioned, which is a whole another can of worms. I won't touch that one because I've met some of those types of folks that have said some really awful things before. But whether they have or have not done that, the regret of it is not a regret that you can act on in a way that puts you back on the same path that you would have been on if you had waited a little longer to make that decision and waited for life circumstances that were not, I'm trapped in my parents' house, I'm stuck going to school, I have certain expectations as like those, your life as a child and as an adult are completely different. As an adult, you have so much more agency over your situation. And when you're in that situation and you have that agency, you're not under control and I think that, to be fair, like I do think that some element of parental control is a good thing. I do think that there is definitely a line, but the idea that it's just automatically good and that we should force that into people's faces, I think that's detrimental for the trans movement, because if we're acting as though that is speaking for all trans people, that every my Discord is full of trans people. Like it is a very, I would maybe almost call it a cis inclusive space. It is overwhelmingly trans. And it is, if you brought this up, there would probably be more extreme versions of what I am saying, like more blunt, more. And these are people who don't regret transitioning. And they say, listen, this is not something you should do as a kid. It's just not something you should do. It's something you should do as an adult who has the agency, who is not under the control of your parents, who is making all of their own decisions and understands the ramifications of decisions, understand the idea. Because as a kid, you don't even understand rent. Rent is so much less complex than transitioning gender. There's just, it's such a completely different life situation. And it's not a situation that I think a child, and this isn't to like detract from children's ability to think or their agency or anything like that. It's just not something that, unless you have lived on your own and understand how you are able to and how you are limited in interacting with the world, it's just a decision that a child can't comprehend in the way that an adult that has been living with agency, with financial agency, which with just a large list of different types of things that you just don't even understand as a child. You shouldn't make those decisions, because if you do regret it, it's something that you, again, to bring up the detransitioning people, they're often very bitter people. And I think that a lot of them are very anti-trans and very against transitioning as a whole because of their own personal experience. It's a very resentful group of people who are upset at certain practices and certain ideas. And I think it would be better if we didn't produce that type of person as often, I guess, would probably be the way to put it.
Damage control. And I think that's what like limits are for, right? And there's a weird crossover between the like latte liberals and granola anarchists. Like, let me explain. Because anarchists would, their rebuttal would to what you were saying would be, what about youth liberation? That's something that they believe, that ultimately we believe in getting rid of all forms of like arbitrary authority, and they see parents as a kind of authority. Like that extreme anarchists on the left would oppose parental like custody of any kind. They're a very small minority, but they exist and are represented within a trademark left.
Yeah, exactly. They're usually the engine behind cancel culture, so to speak. Not Hollywood, but the anarchists, actually. They're the ones doing the foot soldier work.
It's a really weird phenomenon, isn't it? That a ideology whose belief system is centered around direct democracy and essentially consensus would be pro-canceling dissident opinions. I mean, that itself is not contradictory, but it is contradictory to advocate very fringe positions and then support direct democracy, because I don't support direct democracy precisely because I think it would lead to very reactionary conclusions, like immigrants getting kicked out in certain countries.
If you just switched over to that one day, like you have all of the ideology of today existing, like, and then you just suddenly it wouldn't be good. Like, I don't really necessarily believe that it's a good idea to want to force a change in the ideology of people. They think that it kind of follows a lot of the other things that I advocate for rather than leads it. But when I am thinking about the anarchist problem, it's often that sort of spontaneous or institutionless viewpoint that sort of allows for them to essentially allow whatever current ideology is. Like the status quo essentially asserts itself when you're not asserting anything. That's the way I see that kind of anarchist. Like they talk, like for instance, I think Chaz/Chop, whatever you want to call it, is a good example of that. When you had the abolish the police people forming a security force as opposed to police. It's like, well, I mean, that's just the ideology of today occupying your ideology-less situation.
They like killed a black guy.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah, during BLM. Not a good look for anarchism.
I mean, it does prove the thesis that cops would do that, but it's just they didn't think they were cops.
It's funny, but it's so sad. Like,
I know it sucks to laugh at, but like it's also, it's not like a ha ha ha, I'm happy that happened laughing.
Yeah.
It's a, oh my God, things are like this laughing.
This is also, it was such a bad look for communism. I remember.
Well, yeah,
everyone
I mean, that's the problem of representation.
Happen.
That's exactly the problem of representation that I was talking about. I get called like a gay blue hair weirdo. I mean, I'm not entirely not gay, but I don't have blue hair, and I certainly am. I'm called a reactionary by most of the gay blue haired weirdos, and it's because those folks precede me. When I say I'm a communist, and this is why I don't identify myself as a communist in situations in which people don't know I'm a communist already. But when I say I'm a communist, I am given everything that whatever that person knows about Chaz, Chop, and the security forces killing black people, everything they've heard that's bad about anarchists. And by the way, those groups of anarchists are very, very good at getting attention, doing things that nobody wants. I don't know why, but they're very good at that. It might have something to do with the fact that they act as good representation for all of us commies. I don't know. And then there's also the representation of Peter Coffin that gets places before Peter Coffin gets to those places. But I mean, I end up with a lot of viewpoints that are asserted that I have that I just don't have. And I see that in those anarchists that we're talking about.
Yeah, I don't want to bash the anarchists for too long because
No, the thing is I would
I have like a soft spot for the anarchists, even though because I think their hearts are in the right place sometimes, and
I think
they're just
well, that's the problem of basically everything. Like, in all honesty, most people who identify with most ideologies, right and left, their heart is usually in the I want society to get better place. It's just they have very specifically biased ideas as to what better is and as to what will get us to better. Even if we all agreed on what better is, I think that there are big disagreements as to what we would have to do. And I think that that's kind of the problem more. I think more people are good than bad. Like that. I just think that I don't
more
think
people are decent.
Yeah, decent is probably a better word, because honestly, good and bad are kind of just they're relative to the other anyways. But decent, like willing to exist with other people regardless. Like most people are that.
I do want to switch it to the critique of woke outbros, because since we're talking about the left, it's important to talk about like the reaction to the left, because I think there's a fine difference between those who see MAGA communism or like quote unquote reactionary leftism or reactionary socialism, or just anti-wokeness, anti-woke tendencies in general. There's a difference between people who see all of that as just a reactionary tendency in itself, and those who see that as a reaction, kind of a legitimate reaction, even if not so great conclusions. But it's a reaction to something that needs to be addressed. And I think too many people deal with problems by not thinking about them, by just sticking their head in the sand. And I think it's so profitable too. I know so many channels that's like believes the things that we're saying, but they like stick to making anti-woke content. Their whole thing is saying, oh, this person thinks this, haha, cringe, how stupid.
Yeah.
It's like, well, if so many people think this thing, like there must be something that is making them think that thing. What is it? Right? Like,
right.
So what is your thesis of woke outbros and the kind of twofold reaction?
So I think that, well, obviously the image of the woke Ouroboros is a snake eating its own tail. That's basically how I view wokeness, so to speak. And every time I talk about wokeness, somebody's like, well, what you're saying isn't wokeness. Wokeness is blankety blank. And they go back 20 years and decide that that's the definition of wokeness. It's not. Wokeness is a phenomenon. It is also an ideology that I see that, again, that electrical outlet, that analogy applies here. It's a means to redirect people, in my opinion, away from the legitimate concerns that they have, because I do not think that woke people, who are a lot of the time by their enemies just called woke because they're pro like black person or something. I've seen that a lot lately, actually. I don't think that is a problem. I think that's actually very good. I think being pro black person, this is not something that should be controversial to say, but like there are groups that would consider this controversial. Being pro black person is not. It's a good thing. It's
like people who thought the Black Panthers were like extreme hate groups, and then a projection of like
exactly
white politics.
Which, I mean, the Black Panthers did have infiltrators that did work very hard to get them to do violent things, and in some cases succeeded, and in some cases did not succeed, and in fact were subsumed into the Black Panthers. That's a whole nother thing though. But anyway, woke is actually an ideology of progressive aesthetics for what is ultimately the same issues and in a lot of cases, the same bigotries that have persisted. A lot of, in my opinion, wokeness is attempting to take a concern for something like segregation and instead providing a justification for segregation. It's like, there's an example in the book where Michigan University, the premier university from the state I am from, instituted this. It was, I can't remember if it was a Zoom call, if it was actually cafes that they did on campus, but either way, it was a POC cafe and a white cafe, a non-POC cafe. And that is, I mean, by woke standards, it's creating spaces for BIPOC. But if you actually break it down, it's segregation. And it's not actually good because it doesn't really do anything with the conflicts that the concern that it's attempting to alleviate. It's not really doing anything with those conflicts. Instead, it's just sort of, as you said, ignoring it. It's just kind of like, well, Black people, BIPOC, they're just different. They should have their own space. Let them have their own space. We'll put the white people over here. Because when you say
essentialism,
yeah, it's essentialism, and that's the subtitle of the book, Woke Ouroboros, Segregation and Essentialism. It is a progressive aesthetic on those same types of bigotries that allow us to persist in the same dynamics that have been overall used throughout the last 100 or so years. The market dynamics, the what generally have been highlighted as a large perpetrator of inequality. How do we preserve those institutions and ideas while not seeming like we are? That's what wokeness in a lot of ways is. It's in my opinion basically the same thing as anti-wokeness. Like, it's not, I don't, like, they obviously have different aesthetics and different value systems, but I don't see them as different phenomena. They accomplish the same thing, in my opinion. And that's why I say woke Ouroboros as well, because I think ultimately your anti-woke people are just critiquing concerns. Like, oh, an anti-woke person, for instance, would say, well, 13% of the population, or something. I can't remember the statistic that they like to bring up about how Black people are incarcerated more. And an anti-woke person sees that and thinks it's because Black people are more likely to commit crimes. A woke person sees it and says that it's because police are evil. And it's, well, neither of these are really good explanations for why people of color are arrested more, because they completely ignore the actual systemic problem at bay, which is often, it goes way back to a lot of different issues, be it redlining, be it just the general fact that one race of people in this country was enslaved, and therefore when they were freed, they started at zero, much further along than other people started at zero. And that's not even to say that everybody starts at zero. That's also not true. But to simplify, there's just a lot of reasons that poor communities might be over-policed, and there's a lot of reasons why Black people might be in poor communities. It's just,
and racism is just real, and there's an incentive for it to exist in a class-divided society, right?
Well, it's a justifying ideology for class. It does a great, I would say
it's one of the biggest barriers to like class unity in U.S. history, particularly.
Because it does such a good job of taking what is a class issue and dividing it down into a Black-white issue, because it allows people to maintain the thought that there is some reason why Black people are always in the lower class. It allows you to not understand that there's a physical relationship between ownership and the means of production that creates different relationships in society. It allows you to ignore that, and it allows you to look at an identity line that is frankly superfluous in any real, like, physical way, and instead ideologically decide that that is the reason why Black people are arrested more, or Black people are more likely to be poor, et cetera, et cetera. It's such a, like, it is a very good ideology for that. And it's not the only ideology that does that. It's worth saying. And it's certainly, with a lot of people, they are not actually racist. There are a lot of people that, if you ask them individually any of the questions about race, they would give you the right answers. But there are a lot of conditions that are just embedded that it's not even really possible to not have them without substantially changing the arrangement of ownership to things.
Well, and someone might push back on that and saying, racism has always existed, Peter. What are you talking about? But it's a pre-capitalist phenomenon, and I think a good rebuttal to that is that bigotry has indeed always been a feature of humanity to some extent. Bigotry is just like, you are from a different tribe, I don't trust you. You're different, you were like weird, what's up with you? It's like it's in kids, like with the kid who dresses different or whatever, like reads the different
Absolutely.
book. You're weird, I'm not gonna play with you. It's like that's human, that it isn't human nature. But race as like a construct, that there's like a unifying, like all people with black skin are like of a certain essence, which itself was created, kind of really popularized during the Spanish Empire to prevent slaves from converting to Christianity, which they often did to get freed. And then the white race is created later on as a way to prevent partially Irish servants and blacks from unifying, to create a kind of unifying, something to unify non-slaves, basically. And
then it's largely, like, in terms of becoming a real, like, quote unquote, to use a Marxist term, a reified thing, an actual, a physical object in terms of how it is treated, race. A lot of that scientific justification came out of the 1800s. Like, in all seriousness, a lot of
scientific race. Yeah, it's true.
Like, that's what really made race into like a physical object, a thing that is quote unquote real. A lot of the ideological stuff pre the 1800s, I mean, race wasn't even consistently used. Like,
I mean, what did exist, but it was like historical. So,
exactly.
Like, the founding fathers were like, especially Jefferson, were like racist, but in a very different way. Not to not to exonerate them, but like,
no.
Case of Jefferson, he was like, he called them the unfortunate race, and he thought it was because of their conditions as slaves that they were kind of like quote unquote inferior, which is itself a racism, but it's a racism that is like different from like, you are just like kind of subhuman.
Exactly.
Which is what scientific racism try to do with phrenology and all this skull measuring shit.
Exactly. Race wasn't a consistent thing prior to scientific racism. Now, it was used as a word, wasn't, I would say, almost inconsistently applied as a word. But like you said, it's the Spanish Empire that really started quote unquote race. And that is, I mean, I don't want to put that in the capitalist era, because it is definitely pre-capitalist supremacy over the world. But there are certainly elements of the workings of capitalism that were beginning to take root in a lot of societies at that time. It's not as though racism as we know it today goes back to 0 or like a BC year or anything. Like, again, like you said, it's bigotry, or even in a lot of ways it's xenophobia, like people just being afraid of the other country who could invade at any time.
Yeah, that unfortunately is like a big feature throughout human history.
Yes.
Xenophobia just is, and it's also why I think anarchism is a bad idea. It's another like, because when like the recipe of just kicking out other people, like that seems to me very likely in like more homogenous areas. And it's also,
well, I mean,
also
cancel
like,
culture shows it's very likely.
Yeah, and it also undermines their assumptions about what it will be, because their idea is like, it's not just localism, it's a bunch of different local communities all unified under this confederation, and it's not really a government, it's just a bunch of little democratically administration. And what that ignores is like stuff like that existed, pre-states, but what they leave out is that they were always going to war with each other. like the other group was like egalitarian within the group. This is like a big feature of indigenous communities pre-colonization, is like often highly egalitarian internally, but would occupy each other. Like Aztecs were hierarchical even among themselves, so that's a bad example. But like the Cherokee are pretty egalitarian, like internally. But you know, when it comes to fighting the other group, it's that communism isn't as there. So it's like, I don't know if you're. For me, the idea of like localist communism has never really appealed to me.
No,
I think
I think that it's an absurd prospect. It's more, it's asserting that somehow Mad Max could work. It's just, it's not like, that's not a realistic. And the thing is I don't even think that Mad Max like could happen as a bad thing. I think that that's an absurd, it's just an absurdist fictional idea. And there's no bad or good circumstance that would ever actually lead us to, if we did have societal ruin, I don't think it would look like that. I think it would look a lot more like society, just without stuff.
Doesn't Guy Debord have this quote where he's like addressing Marshall McLuhan's global village idea, and he says, "A village, the village is the worst. Living in the village, everyone knows each other, everyone
Yeah.
each other. You have these petty hierarchies. Like that sucks. Why would we want that?"
Well, that's why I think Debord is a worthwhile critic. Like, he is simultaneously in advocacy and in criticism of a lot of the larger Soviet like style projects. I don't think that all of his criticism was entirely fair against those projects, but I think the fact that rather than just like react to it and go like, I think the world should be a village. Instead, he's like, well, I mean, there's a lot of good reasons why we would arrange society in a manner that connects these things and ultimately intends to centrally plan, if not somewhat democratically. There's a reason why those things are built into those ideas, because if you don't, then you get this. And we've proven that you get this. Like, look at previous historical examples of, I mean, the degrowth folks that want to go back to the land. What's that?
It's a good segue.
Oh, yeah.
Big theme of your work.
Yeah. Well, the degrowth folks really want to get back to the land, so to speak. And they want to go back to those previous eras, but they fetishize those eras.
Some of them. I do want to.
Yeah, it's fair. Some of
them are future oriented. Like they think they can have it both.
Sure. But I mean, I would say that they are the rarer breed of those folks. There are very few degrowth people that I think really think about degrowth in terms of, at least in terms of who I have ended up interacting with as a critic of degrowth. It's less those people than it is the back to the land folks. At least this is entirely anecdotal, I'll admit, but those are the people who end up trying to fight me on it. But they want to go back to those societies. They say like, well, look at the indigenous communities. They were communistic, but they ignore those elements that you're talking about. And this is partly as a result due to what we were talking about earlier, which is that somebody gets to speak for the whole of the group. Mm-hmm. And there is no way to assign one view to the whole of any group.
Especially indigenous people.
Yes, especially.
It's like there's just so many different nations that have their own differences. So it's like, it's a signifier that's just annoying itself.
Very much. And in a way, it's actually quite racist. The way that a lot of them do fetishize those societies, because they do in ignoring the human elements of a society, you turn it into something that is, in my opinion, essentialist. It's very bad. It's wrong to look at indigenous people and say, we should model everything off of them because they're in tune with the land. And it's like, this is noble savage stuff.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
Do you know what that is?
Yeah, it's like the empathetic racism.
Exactly. It's gross. I don't like it. And I don't like when we see,
Have you read Graeber's
that-
new book?
I don't.
Yeah, he spends a lot of time attacking that sort of thing, that essentialism of because he's like an anarchist, but he's the kind of anarchist I like.
Yes,
David
no,
Graeber,
I've
in a sense.
back when I was doing Low Society, back before the divorce, we actually had him on once. Um,
Oh yeah,
he,
Graeber died.
yeah, David Graeber.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I wrote Bullshit Jobs, Debt.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
I've read some of his more recent, posthumously released book with David Wengrow, The Dawn of Everything. It's sort of a history of humanity. It's like 500 pages, so I've only
See, I was unaware that they were releasing work of his posthumously, so I'm interested in that. I think that Bullshit Jobs, although I don't necessarily agree with everything in the book, I certainly like the idea. It is true that there is a lot of work being done that is not socially necessary labor to the end that it is pursuing. It's not necessary for a lot of the jobs that we have to get to the end that those jobs are allegedly pursuing. I like David Graeber. Again, he's the type of anarchist that I like as well.
Mhm.
He was also a very nice man, I will say. He was a very pleasant person. He was aware that, I mean, Low Society wasn't exactly an ideologically unified unit, but he was aware
remember
that I think he was aware that I was a Marxist-Leninist, and he did not seem to have a problem with me. In fact, I think we had a lot of good jokes, and it sucked that I didn't get to interact with him as much as I would have liked to, but he was a very good sport, very nice man, very happy to talk about a lot of different issues. If every anarchist was like that, it'd be a lot harder to argue with them.
He was right on a lot of the issues. too.
Very,
On
yes,
cancel culture, on like so many things.
100%.
He was like on the ball. But yeah, speaking of Low Society, I do want to like talk a little bit about some of your history in your kind of like political evolution and interchange of interpersonal relations. I don't know how much you want to get into that. You can get into however as much you want to, but I think that would be a good discussion for the back room because I want to get particularly into your critique of BreadTube, which I remember pissed everyone off at the time. And I will say, I think you went about it in a kind of unprudent way, but you had a lot of legitimate criticisms that I think, especially if we look at a lot of the state of so-called BreadTube today.
I mean,
they were on the ball.
yeah, I mean, exactly what I said would happen happened. Inflammatorily, but I was right.
Right. So we'll get into that. BreadTube.
Nice little tease for people who are going to maybe become a patron and see that end of the podcast.
Right. If you're not a patron already, like, what are you doing? Are you if you got $5, you get access to like tons of exclusive podcasts at this point. What are you doing? If you like the show, support it. And if you're broke, I understand. You just give it a 5-star rating. That'll be good. That'll be nice. And check out Peter's work. And we'll see you in the back room.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimist, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.